Hello, listeners, and welcome to this week's mini-series. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast, and for this segment, I will be chatting with world-leading cult expert, Dr. Alexandra Stein. Alexandra is a writer and educator who specializes in the social psychology of ideological extremism and has published various texts on understanding cults and extremist belief. During our conversation, Alexandra kindly broke down the 5 main characteristics of cults and listed them as such. Number 1. You can identify a charismatic authoritarian leader. Number 2. There is a steep, closed, and isolating hierarchy. Number 3. There is absolute or total ideology. Number 4. The use of techniques of coercive control, often known as thought reform or brainwashing, are present. And 5. The exploitation of followers. It is easy to identify these 5 markers within every conversation that has taken place on this show, whether it be in regards to extreme religion, destructive family environments, or one-on-one cults. The work and research that Alexandra has contributed to the world in regards to cult education is some of the most important work to date. Inside Out, a memoir of entering and breaking out of a Minneapolis political cult, is Stein's own memoir depicting her time spent within a destructive cult. And Terror, Love and Brainwashing, Attachment in Cults and Totalitarian Systems, is a comprehensive breakdown of Stein's research and work around attachment theory in cults, and how these two interlink, and how we can recognize these systems in all manner of societies. For early access to ad-free full-length episodes, please visit patreon.com/The Cult Vault to support the show from as little as £1 a month. But for now, here is Dr. Alexandra Stein. So hello, Alexandra, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and talk with me today. You are a UK-based cult expert that I have wanted to chat to for some time now, and I'm really thankful to have this opportunity today. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Yes, and thank you as well for inviting me. It's good to be able to join in the various different voices that you've had on your podcast so far. Yeah, I'm in the UK, although I did quite a lot of work in the US and lived there for a long time, also as part of my cult experience. But I'm a social psychologist. I'm really specialize in the study of cults and totalitarian systems. I myself was in a cult in the US, in Minnesota, a political cult, and I wrote a book about that experience called Inside Out. And then long story, which I guess we'll cover somewhat as we continue talking, but wrote my second book, Terror, Love and Brainwashing, which is a kind of theoretical contribution to the understanding of these kinds of systems. And yeah, now I live in the UK and I do a lot of work around trying to raise awareness and recovery and overlap a bit into issues of extremism as well. So,
do you ever consult on any legal cases at all, or anything that's UK based and linked to the coercive control that happens over here in the UK?
Not yet, but the charity I work with is working very heavily on that issue and trying to improve the law, and make it include non-intimate or family relationships, which it's now limited to. So that's really one of our main strategies, is to go after that law and improve it.
I'm really looking forward to talking about all of that, especially in regards to the survey that was released this year. So 2016 was when Inside Out was first published, I believe.
No, actually, it was first published in 2002.
Oh.
And I, by a rinky-dink little Minnesota publisher, very unglamorous, I can tell you. The world of publishing is not what one dreams of when one is looking to publish. But nonetheless, they did publish it, and I thank them for it. But then it kind of went out of print from there, and they couldn't really manage it after a few years. Well, after quite a few years. So I took back the rights and republished it without a couple of their typos, in the 2016 version, but otherwise it's pretty much the same. So
Right. So a second edition released in 2016.
I mean, I guess what was important to me in 2016 was the publication of Terror, Love, and Brainwashing, which is a much more important book in my view. I'm proud of both of them, and they're very different books, but I think the second one has more to offer people in a way, who are interested in this area. And that just had a second edition come out last year. Wait, no, this year. Yeah. So like I said, there's been quite a lot going on since 2016.
Oh, so a second edition for Terror, Love, and Brainwashing as well for 2022. I will make sure that I put the links in the episode description for both of these works so that listeners can go and grab copies if they wish to do so. So you're now in the world of cult education, cult recovery, activism with the charity that you work with. And this all came from your own experience of being involved in a destructive cult. Was it an organic choice for you to move into cult education for yourself once you escaped your group?
I suppose it was, because when I got out of my group, I did what a lot of people do. And I thought to myself, how the hell did this happen to me? How did I get essentially trapped for 10 years in this situation where I was told what to do, down to intimate and small details of life? And I just, I was raised in a family that, really valued independent critical thinking. And I think before I joined the cult, in many ways, I was an independent and critical thinker, as much as a young person in their 20s can be. So when I came out of this cult, it was just like, how did this happen? I couldn't work it out. I wasn't the stereotype of someone who gets recruited into a cult. I was this kind of rather tough young woman, feminist, anyway, quite clear about my identity in a lot of ways. So really it was that question, the how could this have happened question, and how does it happen to people generally, that kind of spurred me on, because I guess by nature I'm a kind of curious person. And I think I am a person who always has been interested in the patterns of human interaction. And, the kind of what I do now, social psychology, I don't think I knew it was called that, but, how human beings relate to each other across societies. So that was a natural road for me to start going down. But before I did, rather quickly after I got out, I got involved with CAN, which was the Cult Awareness Network, which later got taken over, ironically and evilly, by Scientology. But back then it was a real cult awareness network. And so rather early on after I got out, I became kind of active and stuff. And even though in my recovery counseling, I often counsel people not to do that too quickly, I did do it rather quickly. And then later got involved a little bit with the American Family Foundation, which was the precursor to the International Cultic Studies Association. So I kind of go back quite a long way with some of these organizations. So I guess that's organic. It was a natural move for me. And I think the other thing was, because I had always been a political person, came from a political family, was in a political cult, of a supposedly left-wing variety. So when I came out, in trying to find a way to regain some real political activity as opposed to the fake political work of the cult, this became a way for me to express that side of myself, because it's clearly working around cult issues is a very liberatory theme, people are oppressed in cults and in cultic states. And we, of course, in America, we have the example of Trump as a, kind of cultic political figure. So it also met that need for me of trying to find a bit of a home for that desire to have a positive effect in society.
With the current state of the UK, America, and the world, for those that feel similarly to how you felt when you were in your 20s, do you feel like now is potentially a dangerous time for individuals in regards to certain social themes that we are seeing repeated from history, like the war between Russia and the Ukraine right now, with the recession, the cost of living crisis? We've just lived through a pandemic, probably should put that one out there. And of course, when you throw in the digital age with all of those things as well, we know from certain periods in history that there is a chance people may be more vulnerable than usual when those extra things are in play.
Absolutely. I think it's a very frightening time. I try to be positive. I try to find the positive things that are going on, but it's quite difficult right now. And of course, the other thing we need to mention is the climate emergency. So I think for young people, there's a lot of motivation in a way to try to change things. And that was my motivation when I was a young person. I mean, when in my day, in the 70s, we were very much not thinking. I mean, in my 20s, I didn't think I'd live to see 30. Now, that sounds melodramatic, but that was the feeling. There was the Vietnam War. There was a lot of fear around nuclear. Things felt very unstable. And yes, again, we're seeing that. And I think there is a risk for young people of getting involved in dangerous groups. And that's why it's particularly important we try and get education out, and particularly about political cults. I'm very concerned about political cults on the left, or the supposed left. But equally, that can be a motivation for people to get involved in religious or spiritual cults, because the end of the world is coming. You get all those kind of narratives, or the spiritual stuff. If we pray hard enough, we'll put a stop to whatever's happening, or we can escape it, because that's another tendency, is for people to just try to check out and enter a spiritual realm so they don't have to deal with the actual rather grim realities we're facing. So I think getting education out there about what a dangerous group looks like, and also what a healthy group looks like, is really important, so people can have some tools to evaluate their involvements. And I think for myself, if I'd had a little bit of that education when I was young, I could have made better choices, because I would have maybe noticed or seen as red flags that the group was very secretive, that they weren't that great at answering my questions, that they wanted this kind of confession of my entire life background, that the controlling elements, that they started telling me weird things to do, what kind of job to get, what kind of relationships to have or not have. Now I would know that all these things are warning signs. And so I think it's very teachable, and unfortunately in the mainstream, we're not really teaching it yet. So I think things like your podcast and other people's efforts are really valuable in getting the word out there about what some of these red flags are. That even if it sounds like it's a good cause, you have to get beyond the rhetoric and look at their actions and evaluate them. And because again, going back to my case, instead of doing political work for the 10 years I was in that group, I was actually completely taken out of the political sphere. And I mostly baked bread and wrote computer programs and endless self-criticisms. It was because they're not what they say they are in cults. That's their nature. Or you're raising money for the leader, or you're doing something, but you're not actually doing something that's going to push forward progressive agendas. So yeah,
there was a discussion on Reddit the other day on the r/cult subreddit taking place around the recent documentary Orgasm Inc. that was released on Netflix regarding One Taste. And somebody commented saying that they went to one of the workshops and it was a kind of pay at the door event, and they showed the orgasmic meditation demonstration, and then people paired off to take part in their own experience of orgasmic meditation. But this individual who posted said that there was no one left, so they didn't pair up with anybody, and that's kind of where their experience of One Taste ended. And then they said, and this was the most interesting part for me, they finished by saying, it felt a bit culty at the workshop, but there wasn't really anything dangerous going on. I guess that the real problem started when you became an integrated member of the group. And I just replied saying that is how every cult starts, I think. I think every cult in history has exactly that same funneling system in place. Would you agree?
Yes. I mean, this is now, of course, we're not talking here about people who are born or brought up in cults, because they just arrive by being born, But Ben Zablocki, who passed away a few years ago, he's very good on this in terms of people like myself who got recruited into cults. That he splits the process into two parts, and he talks about recruitment, and then the second part is retention. And they're different, and they have different qualities. And I think that's and which is that person was really describing in a way. And I think it's a very helpful analytical way of looking at it, because people get very confused between those two. So in the recruitment process, and again, people born in don't go through the recruitment process. Now, they may experience the retention process. In fact, they do, because most cults want to keep those born-ins in. But so recruitment, and this kind of relates also to Hannah Arendt's work, who I quote a lot in my work. She talks about the difference between propaganda and indoctrination, and those map to those two different phases. So in recruitment, you see propaganda. And as she talks about it, propaganda has one foot in the real world. So you can't just start talking about creatures shooting out of volcanoes and inhabiting you in the recruitment stage, because people would just go, you're completely crazy, and they would walk away. So you talk instead, if you're Scientology, about personality tests. And are you feeling depressed? And are you lonely? And do you want to succeed better at business? And, this, that, and the other. Things that most people would have some kind of hook into. Or, there's various versions of this, right? Depending on the group. They're going to go after a certain population with a certain hook. Recently we've been talking in the UK about the United Church of the Kingdom of God. And there's a wonderful young woman who you may want to interview. She's fantastic, who's been doing a lot of activism about this. And this is a Brazilian-based cult that's now global, has, I think, millions of members, run by a Brazilian gangster billionaire, mostly focused on recruiting kids of color in this country. And their recruitment, they have these so-called help centers. We're going to help you. And then the list of things they can help you with is, any problem any human might have. Do do you need a boyfriend? Do you need a job? Do you, whatever it is. So that's a long way of talking about the propaganda of the recruitment phase. Has to appeal to something real, has to be connected to something in the real world. And then you're going to pull people in through that. Yes, I'll come to your help center and there's nice singing and I'll come and check it out. Now, not everybody at that point is going to stay, like your person you just quoted. In fact, a lot of people will never come back again, right? You don't need them all. It's like a car salesman. Not every punter is going to buy your car, but some of them are. So it's the same kind of idea. So some of those people, you pull in more and you start getting them more involved over time. And then you start to move into the retention and indoctrination part of the process, which then starts getting people further and further away from anything real. And that's when you start bringing out the picture of the leader and mentioning that he perhaps has a word directly from God. Or maybe, he even is God. Who knows? He's pretty special. And that takes time. That's not an instant process. It takes time. It takes the whole process of pulling people away from their prior environment and starting to engulf them in this new environment. And we kind of know now how that works. But anyway, to cut a long story short, it's very useful to see those as two related but different phases of the process.
I suppose at that point as well, where additional information that's perhaps hidden or purposefully kept back until a person's certain stage in a group, at that point, the individual has likely invested something into the group that would be difficult to get back, whether that is time or money, or in some wild cases, collateral of some type that might stop them from immediately just saying, okay, now this is a bit too much. Of course, on top of everything else that they're experiencing around the isolation, long hours of activity and group stimulation and whatever coercive tactics are at play within specific groups.
I mean, I know a lot of people, and including this guy, Ben Zablocki, talk a lot about the investment and the sunk costs. I think there is truth to that, but I'm personally less interested in that element. I'm more interested in the isolation and the fear, and those as being obstacles to being able to leave. I'm not ruling out the sunk cost, but I think we have something even more emotive, if you will, and more powerful than just that, because that puts it in, for me, just a little bit too in too economic terms. And these are emotional relationships that get formed to these groups. And they are fear-based. Fear is the driving force of cults. So we can talk about that more. Yeah.
I think that's really insightful. Of course, as somebody that's not only a leading expert in the field, but somebody that's also lived through that experience and can speak firsthand about how it feels to be a part of a group, and how you may have stayed a bit longer than you would have if fear wasn't in play. I'm not somebody that's had one of those personal experiences, so it's imperative to those of us that are hearing these stories that we get to understand the lived experience. And that's why these interviews and this podcast, I think, are an incredible resource for people that want to know more, but perhaps don't know where to start, or wouldn't be sure what questions to ask. I'm still not sure what questions to ask. And then people come back to me with things like, actually, it's not so much about the sunk cost fallacy, but about other things. And of course, as we know from some of the interviews that have been conducted on the show, is that fear can take shape in many forms. That could be shunning from your family, friends, or all of the relationships you've made in a group, fear of the end times, and if you walk away from the group, then you're no longer going to be saved or safe. Fear can physical punishment or public shaming. There's so many different ways that fear can can manifest into a real situation for individuals. So that's a really insightful thing that you've just added there. Thank you so much for that, Alex. That's great.
And also, I'll tell you a bit of a story. I mean, in my first book, what I did try to do, so my first book is a memoir, and I tried to write it, which I think a lot of the memoirs that are coming out probably try to do the same things, so that I hoped someone could identify enough that they could sort of by proxy have some of those feelings and have some understanding of how I could have stayed so long. And after I'd been in it a year, I left because there were various things going on that pushed me past a comfortable place. But when I left, first of all, I'd been moved from California to Minnesota. And so I didn't have any of my old friends there. I had been sort of in an arranged marriage in the group. And when I left, my husband wasn't allowed to talk to me. So, here I am in Minnesota. I think it was in winter, which is a terrible time in Minnesota. And I was in some apartment and I had nobody. My family were in London. And, this was back in the 80s. We didn't have the internet. It was really hard to communicate. You had to, call them for a lot of money. So I was completely isolated when I left after that first year. And of course, I didn't know anything about cults. I just knew that there was this political group. I was uncomfortable with things they were doing. I now didn't have my husband and I didn't have anyone else. And after I sat more or less alone in this apartment for 3 months, I went back. And I went back for 9 years. So they had succeeded in isolating me, first of all. And I know it's hard in this internet age to imagine what it's like to be in a middle America, thousands of miles from anyone, without any internet. There was letters and occasional phone calls. So, and, not with my husband, who I loved, even though it was a kind of arranged situation. Nonetheless, we had a relatively good relationship. So, and I had no framework to understand what this experience was. I had not a clue. I certainly didn't think I was in a cult. I thought cults were for hippies in orange robes, like people still think. So I just was like, I can't describe it, but I had no way to analyze what had happened. And in that kind of confusion, and what I call a nameless fear, I went back because that's what was there for me. There was nothing else there available.
Did you have a particularly difficult time reintegrating back into the group because of that step away that you took?
Well, I had to sit in a hearing. I had to be like a kind of trial where I had to say what a bad person I was, and so, I mean, it wasn't terribly nice, no. There were other things that weren't terribly nice that I think you can read my book for. I won't go into them now, but, it was, I wouldn't say integrating. That's a kind of funny word to use. I don't know why, but it just is. You're back in the group, you're integrated, you're following orders again. But yeah, it was not particularly nice. And then I had to kind of kowtow to the things I'd objected to, which is why I'd left. I had to kind of say, oh no, well, I guess you were right and I was wrong. It was kind of, I suppose, humiliating. But so had I had somebody I could have talked to and not been so isolated, I think I would have been able to get out at that point. And certainly if I'd understood anything about cults at that point, I would have been able to say, oh, this is a cult. Let me get out of here as fast as I can. But there was none of that. Whereas the second time, 9 long years later, when I got out with 2 other people, where we had kind of broken the internal silence, because you're in a cult, not allowed to share your doubts with anyone. That's a big no-no. But we had broken that silence and started talking to each other. And that was incredibly important. And there were a couple other things that had happened also in my first book. And so we had support. I had support to plan my way out. And then also when I got out, I was lucky because within 3 months, I came across Steve Hassan. Actually, not his work at first, but anyway, it's a kind of a story. But I found a local support group, who sent me a packet of information, including Lifton's 8 criteria. And I just ticked every one and went, oh my God, that explains this experience. And then later I found Steve's work. And then through Steve's work, through Combating Cult Mind Control, there was a little footnote in there about some cults are political, was Janja Lalich's article, one of her early articles. And I ended up calling her up long distance, again, still pre-internet, and saying, oh, I've just come out of a political cult. And she gave me some really great opportunities, and we've been colleagues ever since. Because back then, no one thought cults were political. Now it's, I think, better understood, especially after Trump has been a good lesson in that. So it's, not only is it hard for people to get out without having either some support, some break in their isolation, or some information, but it's also hard for people to recover. So, a lot of the people I work with, whether it's individually or in the support group, they may have been out of their group, well, some of them up to 20, 30 years. And they finally come across something and they go, oh, that was a cult. And then they want to process it, because it's been put in what my other colleague, Mary Russell, calls the too difficult box. They just haven't, it was this horrible experience. They've never been able to really understand it. So, often people come much quicker than that, but it's surprising. There's generally speaking a lag in the time between when someone gets out and when they seek support. Because when they get out, they have not yet understood that this was a cult, and something has to cross their paths to help them, whether it's a podcast or a movie or a book or something, or a person telling them. And then once they give it a name, they can get access to resources that can help.
That is the end of part 1 of this mini-series with Dr. Alexandra Stein. For more information on Alexandra's work, please follow the links in the episode description. To get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com, or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.